Greetings, Walt Disney International Global Futures Team's advanced practitioners. It's Frank Spencer again, your friendly neighborhood futurist, and I'm here to share with you today the video module on the ladder of inference. Now, as you will remember, there's not a lot that we ever actually did with the ladder of inference. But one of the things, amongst two or three things that I want to show you in this video that I know are going to be extremely helpful for you, they are for me all the time when we're doing strategic foresight work at Kedge, is how to actually take this concept of the ladder of inference, which you always share with those who are just starting their foresight journey, usually those who you're onboarding for the global futures teams, and how to use it in a much more integrative and immersive and hands-on way when you're developing trend decks or when you're working with the existing team, even when you're building different parts of the strategic foresight process. That the ladder of inference is not just a concept, it is a tool as well that can be used in several different settings, under several different circumstances, in several different ways that can really help you to build strategic foresight. So of course, to start us off in this module, let me just remind all of us that bias and assumptions are an important, critical part of strategic foresight work. Why? Because in strategic foresight, bias and assumption plays a big part in how we see not only the present, not only our surroundings, but how we see the future unfolding. Remember, everybody's really thinking about the future, even people who are convinced in their mind before they start this work that I don't have to think about the future, it's a waste of my time, this futures thinking thing is silly. They just need to understand, first and foremost, that they're thinking about the future, they're just doing it in unconscious ways. And so the ladder of inference is part of a set of tools that we use at Kedge and that other futurists use that would be a part of what might be called unconscious bias assumption, unconscious bias assumption. And many companies all over the world use unconscious bias modeling with their employees to help them in terms of talent management, in terms of work environment, so that they are not biased in the way that they see things, see their fellow co-workers, see their processes, see their activities, etc. You can only start to imagine, and we're going to get into a little bit of that in this video module, of how biases can get in the way of our everyday work. So if that's the case, then biases and assumptions can definitely get in the way of building alternative, multiple, future scenarios and landscapes of the future, mapping the future. And so before we start to do any kind of futures work, it's very important that we first address biases and assumptions, not just in our audience, but in ourselves. Because if we don't, then we're going to build the same future, even if it's slightly different. We're going to build the same future that we think and see today. And so to really be able to stretch ourselves, not only plausibly, but provocatively, we need to first address biases and assumptions. And so let's take a look at several different ways that futures thinking and unconscious bias modeling, or bias and assumption modeling, go hand in hand. In reality, even before unconscious bias modeling became a big deal with companies, and as you'll see in this video module, Google. We always tell you don't Google, X, Y, and Z, right? So I'm going to do it today. Google actually uses unconscious bias modeling a lot in their company. What I was trying to say is Google actually holds a lot of classes, a training on unconscious bias modeling. It's one of the first things that their new employees have to go through is unconscious bias training. because not only do they want their employees to be able to think provocatively inside of Google, but they know that they have such a large organization and so much interaction and complexity going on that they need to try the best they can to get those biases and assumptions out of the way in terms of workforce and engagement and team building and groupthink, etc., etc. Because if they don't, then these things will influence not only the products and services and experiences that they're making, but also the way their teams interact, and they won't be as effective as they could be. So in futures thinking, unconscious bias modeling is old. It's been around as long as futures thinking itself has. Because as I just explained, we do not, as good futurists, attempt to model the future, to map the future, to future empower our teams and our organizations until we've first addressed bias and assumption. Now, this is an ongoing process in futures thinking and strategic foresight. You will remember tools like CLA, which is going to have its own video module. That's an unconscious bias modeling tool. But there are many others as well. And really just diving down to values or looking at across a cone of possibilities or the torch of possibilities and seeing different outcomes is a type of bias modeling that we're addressing those biases of an official or linear future. So thinking, futures thinking and unconscious bias modeling go hand in hand, and they have for a long time. It's all the rage in organizations like Google now, but futures thinking has been using it for a long time, and it's an integral part of futures thinking. Also, another thing to think about when we're thinking about futures thinking and unconscious bias modeling is just how as I said a few minutes ago, futures thinking itself really helps us to address those deep biases within organizations. If you stop and think about it, it's one of the things that makes people uncomfortable about futures thinking and strategic foresight. Think about this. People don't like to think about the future because it's an unknown commodity. And it makes a lot of people uncomfortable. And it's actually the process of becoming comfortable with futures thinking that is a big part of our job as futurists, is making people comfortable, more comfortable, as comfortable as possible, with strategic foresight and futures thinking, because it's going to always be an unknown commodity. As a matter of fact, we want to look across a swath of multiple alternative futures. So we're making it an even more unknown commodity than those who haven't tackled futures thinking, strategic foresight might imagine that it even is. And so the very act of futures thinking in itself is a bias buster. It's a bias and assumption a breaker. And so it's inherent within the work that you're doing as a futurist. You are unconscious bias modeling agents within the Walt Disney Company. And it's one of the reasons that people, as I said, are very uncomfortable with foresight and futures thinking. And so there are ways on the front end and throughout the entire process of foresight to help people to become more in tune with their biases, with their assumptions, with to recognize them, and not to necessarily change them, although if we are growing up in any facet of life, whether it just be in our personal lives or in our professional lives, our biases and assumptions will naturally be challenged and hopefully somewhat change, especially if they're limiting. So this is a big job that you have as a futurist. So our mental models, our beliefs, our assumptions, our deeply held internal pictures of how the world works, they affect what we see, and they shape how we act. And that's why as a futurist it's very important for us to address these mental models, at least be aware of them, and that's what the ladder of inference helps us to do. So one of the ways that this happens, and that we've never talked about before in any of our training, but that you may already be familiar with, and you can see the tie between futures thinking and these different kinds of bias and assumption models or training, that we've never addressed specifically, is this test called the implicit association test. Now, this is a test that was developed at Harvard University several years ago when researchers and psychologists began to notice that when they would give people the regular questionnaires and tests that asked them how they felt in certain situations, if they felt good or bad about a situation, if they felt positive or negative about a situation. Psychologists began to recognize that, wait a second, those tests are very faulty. Why? Because the participants, the takers of the test, because of the culture, the environment, the process, you know how to answer those tests. You know what people are looking for in this test. And so you tend to answer the test the way that you think you should answer it, the way that you would like for yourself to be viewed. You don't want yourself to be viewed as somebody who's biased or maybe racist or partial to a certain political viewpoint or whatever the case might be. And so you model yourself in those kinds of tests to be the person that you think others want to see you as, or the way that you would like to be, not the way that is still inherent within your thinking or your mental model or your landscape. And so those tests are very faulty. And so our psychologists at Harvard, our friends at Harvard, developed this test called the implicit association test. You've probably taken something like this before. If you actually look up implicit association tests, one of the first links you'll find on Google is this link to Harvard, where they'll let you take what you're seeing on the screen right now, different tests for free. And you can actually take different implicit association tests. So congratulations, and you're welcome. You'll probably be off taking some of these tests now because they're fun. But you can take different implicit association tests around religion, around gender, around sexuality, around weight or race. Basically, in a nutshell, what these tests show, and here what you're seeing on the screen is a screenshot from a link that I'm providing you of an actual training that takes place at Google around unconscious bias modeling. This particular video, which shows one of these training sessions, lasts about an hour. But if you really want to get to the meat of what we're talking about here with the ladder of inference and unconscious bias modeling and how to use these tests throughout the strategic foresight process to make your foresight work better, then I would say, in terms of this video, watch the first 14 minutes. That's where it starts to really trail off into something else. Have fun. I'm sure that some of you will watch the whole hour. It does get fascinating. But the first 14 minutes of this video are really good, something to watch, especially if you want to understand our implicit association test that we were showing on the slide before. So basically, what happens in these tests is the test giver will say to the audience, as you see here on the video, I'm going to show you a series of words or images. And I want you to associate them with either what you see on the left side of your screen or what you see on the right side of your screen. And so they may start with something like male or female, and show words like husband or a wife or grandmother or grandfather or boy or daughter or son, etc., etc. Or even just words in society that we might associate being male or female. For instance, liberal arts or science, because most of us would agree that we, generally speaking, associate liberal arts with female and science with male. It shouldn't be that way. I agree it should not, but we have tended to do that over the generations. Hopefully that's changing somewhat. But they've shown in these tests it's not changing as much as we think it is. And so participants or test takers will see these words on the screen, and they will raise their left hand and say, left for male and right hand for female. And so they'll give this test several different ways. And then what they'll do is say, maybe, for instance, and you'll see this in this video if you watch the first 14 minutes, they will say, now I'm going to show you different images or different words, and I want you to associate it with if the word is either male or science or female or liberal arts. And that still makes the test pretty easy, because words that look feminine or images that look feminine or words that associate with liberal arts or look like liberal arts, you will raise your right hand, and vice versa, for the male or science, you'll raise your left hand. But then what happens, and it doesn't matter if they take this do this in order, the order that I'm talking to you about right now or not, inevitably, when they mix up male with something like, for instance, say liberal arts, as you're seeing on the screen here, and female with something like science, which seems like to the mind to be a little bit of a dichotomy. People have a really hard time taking the test. And then they show the images and they show the words, and people, it takes them longer to raise their hand, and they don't know which one to associate it with. And it tends to show that we have a bias towards the things we favor or what we believe society has told us to be, etc., etc. So why is that important to foresight? You might want to give a test like this. It'd be a lot of fun. It's important because in foresight, what we're also talking about, and as you've seen with the ladder of inference, is that we are always looking at our environment, and we're taking in tons of information all the time. As a matter of fact, as you see in this slide here, we receive 11 million bits of information every moment. This is actually in the training, if you go back to the link and watch it. However, we can only consciously process about 40 bits of that 11 million bits of information that we're taking in at every moment. So, what do? We don't block out, believe it or not, the other 10,900,000, whatever. I'm not going to try to do my math right here. We don't block it out. What we actually do is that we unconsciously filter the other 99.99996%. We take it in, but it becomes unconscious. We have algorithms, qualitative internal algorithms, to take this in. As a matter of fact, if you watch the video from Google, because we watched it several times to see how they were doing unconscious bias modeling in their organization, you'll see the test givers say, in New York City, there's algorithms that we use at every moment. This would happen in Mexico City or in LA or in Buenos Aires or in Moscow or in any of these huge cities where at any moment there's so many people crossing the street that we're using unconscious algorithms in our mind to say, should I go to the left or the right of this person? Which way are they going? How should I move through the city, etc., etc. But this is all unconscious. We're all doing it unconsciously. As a matter of fact, it gives a great example for standing on the subway platform in New York City. And he says to the average New Yorker, this is a no-brainer. To somebody from out of town, they don't know to use this unconscious bias filter. And that is that if you see the subway train come up and you see two subway cars, and the first one is packed with people, and the second one's empty, the smart New Yorker knows to get into which car? They know to get into the car that's packed with people. Because that means if a car in New York City comes up, a subway car, and there's nobody in it, something's wrong in that car, and that people are avoiding it like the plague. Whereas somebody like myself, who's not from the big city, might say like, oh my gosh, like, nobody's getting in the car that's empty, I'll get in that one. Big mistake, and I make the mistake of not having that unconscious bias filter that an average New Yorker might have. So we all have this unconscious bias filter. If we didn't, we go crazy. We need it to be able to not only block out information that's not important for our daily lives, families, and jobs, but we also need to build those unconscious algorithms that we rely on so much. Here comes the problem. It's good that we rely on those unconscious biases to help us walk around cities and know to avoid empty subway cars and to know what to do on a daily basis. 99.9999% of the things that we don't need to think about, we just need to do. However, that kind of unconscious bias information can get in the way of seeing things that we need to more deeply consider and not take for granted. Especially, as I've often said to the group, to all of you guys, if you're heavy into tech, which is nothing wrong with that, tech's a big part of our lives and our future, and we need to pay attention to it. But say that I'm a techie. This is an easy one to pick on because it's out there a lot. And so I'm always taking in information about tech, and a lot of it's unconscious. and we don't realize that we're avoiding social aspects or what the social might do to the tech, or we just think technology is going to save the world by itself, whereas there's all these other big curves of growth going on that are political and economic and environmental in nature and technological as well. So, of course, we need to at least be aware of these unconscious biases and assumptions, and the ladder of inference is a great model that helps us to do that, but also can be used in a very practical way. So as I said to you earlier, and I think this is a great point to share with your audience, is that you can also share in, say, for instance, a primer or a strategic foresight primer, is that when we take people in futures thinking and strategic foresight out of the present and we lift them out and we suspend disbelief and we put them into future scenarios and future landscapes and future maps across multiple future possibilities, and they're living there in deep scenarios that are embedded with values and things and people and flora and fauna and all of the surroundings that are in these future worlds, then we're able to let go more easily of those present biases and assumptions. And so when people do unconscious bias modeling, which is a big consulting business now, and there's companies that do only that and make multi-millions of dollars on doing unconscious bias modeling and training in companies like Google, and they almost always do it from the place of talking about bias through the lens of today, the biases we have today, the way things are today, and then wanting to break that up and say, but see how you're thinking and you need to think differently. But in foresight, when we lift people out of the present and we put them into the future, they're automatically sort of like a weight's off their shoulder. They might not even realize it. And this is how unconscious bias modeling is happening unconsciously in strategic foresight and futures thinking at all times. And so when we get more intentional about addressing biases and assumptions through the tools of strategic foresight and futures thinking, then it becomes even more powerful. Because what we can do is we can actually, as we see on this slide and the one after it, we can actually address in very practical and tactical ways the biases that people have that will in turn help us to inform the future and build more robust scenarios. Once we realize our biases, once we break through those, our landscape gets bigger, our ladder gets bigger, our ladder of inference gets bigger. So when we approach unconscious bias modeling from the landscape of today, we tend to automatically and subconsciously filter any new information through the lens of our present perspectives. The hidden biases and assumptions of our guiding narrative, they overpower any change or innovation that we desire to make. But when we take people and we pick them up, and we allow them to think about the future in immersive and transformative and provocative ways, then approaching change from a lens of alternative futures frees us to think beyond our present obstacles, biases, assumptions, and lets us have a perspective of unseen opportunities that allows us to make a bigger cone. So again, my bias here is that looking through the small end of a cone to try to break up biases is extremely hard. But futures thinking is a great tool to break up our biases. And in turn, when those biases are broken up, or at least acknowledged, then our cone becomes larger to build better futures thinking and better strategic foresight for strategy development, innovation development, etc. So therefore, we can have and see more strategies, more innovations, more products, more experiences, more services. So one of the things that we've always done together, and all of you are very familiar with, but we didn't actually give you as a module within your training manual, is the IC game. And now that I've given you some of this information over the last 15, 20 minutes or so, you probably can think to yourself, oh, I see why Kedge does the IC game now. I just thought it was a fun tool, an icebreaker. It is those things, and you could use it that way. But it also is a great way to start the process of unconscious bias modeling through the lens of strategic foresight to build good foresight teams and good foresight culture in your organization and good foresight outcomes in terms of futures wheels and patterns in your scenarios, etc. So the IC game is something that I want you to be able to have and do to be able to do the tests that I've shown you before in the unconscious bias modeling and the implicit assumption tests that we have already been talking about. So remember, when you're doing IC, and You don't need to have the bands. You could just have people hold up a green, red, and yellow piece of paper, or I'm sure that you can think of other ingenious ways to do this. But the way we've always done it, and you'll remember, is we bring the wristbands, and we have a green one and a yellow one and a red one, and we say, hey, look, we're going to show the audience here an image or a set of words or a title or an article title. And then we're going to ask you to give us your gut reaction. In other words, your immediate visceral reaction. We don't want you to think about it. I want you to unconsciously tell me how you feel about this. If you feel positive, hold up the green band. If you feel negative, hold up the red band. And if implicitly, viscerally, gut reaction, you have a neutral response to the image or to the words, hold up a yellow band. It means you're neutral. And so I'll just show them an image then. For instance, I'll say, here's number one, and then we'll show you something like this. I don't think maybe you've ever seen this one before, but some of you may have seen the movie The Robot and Frank. I think that's the name of it. I get these wrong sometimes. I got so many movie ideas and thoughts go through my head at one time. Great movie to watch, by the way, in terms of robot-human relations and one perspective of it. And so how do you feel about this image? Do you feel green? Do you feel yellow? Do you feel red? And then, of course, just 30 seconds, which is really too long. If you see everybody's already there, move on past the image. And say, okay, everybody raise their hand and tell me how you feel, in whatever way that you choose to differentiate these feelings, pieces of construction paper or whatever. You'll be able to see in the room that people feel different ways about it. Why? For the same reason that appeared in the implicit test that Google uses, or the unconscious bias modeling that they do in their workshops, because people do not realize that they're reacting. Think about this for a second. That you are reacting to all the stimuli around you, even the stimuli that you're conscious about, you're filtering through the unconscious algorithms that you use every day. What is the chance that everything you see and do through that day is going to be filtered, even the things you're conscious about, through your unconscious algorithms and filters? Well, as I showed you earlier on one of the slides, you have a 99.99996% chance of filtering it through. That's pretty high. In other words, you've got a 0.00004% chance that you're not going to filter a piece of information through the unconscious filters and algorithms that you have. That means that we really need to know what those unconscious filters are that we have and be aware of them, increasingly aware of them, if we're going to build good strategy in our organizations, if we're going to be aware of where the future is taking us, if we're going to build good foresight in our organizations, if we're going to really be aware of what a real innovation actually looks like, etc., right? And so now everybody in the room is holding up different colors or similar colors, and you can ask them, why do you feel this way? Don't tell them what, the image actually means yet. Just let them think about it. And then what you might do is, say, now that you've done that, remember your first piece of paper, or if you somehow miraculously got the bands, that'd be cool. Leave the first band on your hand, and you're going to be putting the second band on top of that one to add to the color so that we see the change that took place. Your first reaction to the first picture might have been green. But maybe when I show you this second image, or now a title to an article, or a title to a movie that image came from, it might change the way you feel because I'm adding information. I'm adding layers of information. You have more information, it's going to change the way you feel about it. And you're going to filter it differently. Remember, most information that we see throughout the day, we see quick and we don't even acknowledge that we did. Words that we hear, conversations going on, all this is being taken in. But the more information we have, different biases come into play, different filters come into play, different personal algorithms come into play, and we look at things in a different way. We weigh it differently. So now with the second set of information, what new color would you add? It might be the same. You might have green again, or it might be yellow or red. And so in this particular instance where we saw The Robot and Frank, then we show this title, Rise of the Robots. Now it gives you a little bit different view because the first image might have been something like, here comes my biases and assumptions, right? The way that the elderly and robots would interact with one another and how robots could be used for the elderly. And I have a little bit of a positive image about that. It could be somewhere between green and yellow maybe. I might go green. When I see Rise of the Robots, the word rise itself, it sounds intimidating and could be militaristic to some people. And this doesn't sound as good. Or maybe you disagree with me completely right now. You think Rise of the Robots sounds fantastic, like my younger son feels. And so maybe you go yellow to green on this, or maybe you go green to yellow or green to red on this. And you'll see the change that people have in the room. You remember how this works. Everybody raises their hand. And so this is a great test to do that we use in place of the implicit bias test that you saw earlier that Google was using. We prefer something like IC, which we developed at Kedge, because it literally allows us to see worlds, unfolding trends, emerging issues, and emerging articles, rather than just looking at things from the present. So there's nothing wrong with the other tests, but this is actually a more future-oriented way to do implicit bias modeling. And then, of course, you would ask them one more time, but this time take 5 minutes. And after I show you what the whole article is actually about, I want your group to come to consensus. So break them off into groups of 3 or 4 people, and then ask them to choose one more color, but this time everybody in the group needs to choose the same color. And then, of course, you would show them what the actual article was about. The rise of the robots, in this particular case, was about consumers and citizens, people benefiting greatly from the rise of robots. They can serve us as workers and partners, give us new perspectives, labor, forced leisure. Will it allow us to stop doing labor jobs and think more? How will it change the economy, et cetera, et cetera? And then, ask the whole group to take 5 minutes, debate among themselves, come to consensus. Why do we do this? Well, the same reason that any unconscious bias modeling consultant and professional might do a test like this, and that's because it's important to see that we're influenced by group think, by group pressure, but also that throughout the day, a lot of our decisions and biases come from groups and not just from individual thinking. They come from the way our family raised us, our culture, our surrounding, our city that we live in, etc., etc. And that, therefore, as we often say, foresight is a team sport, because we need to question one another and challenge one another. We don't need to get in arguments about it. We just need to say, I can see it a different way, and I see your perspective, and I'm bending and you're bending, and that helps us to see the future more. And so, of course, now ask the groups, how come this group went yellow, but this group over here went red, and the group in the middle went green? We would like to hear the different perspectives, and everybody in the room now gets to partake in this futures thinking and foresight-oriented way of seeing an issue from the perspective of bias and assumption modeling. This is a slide, by the way, that Yvette threw in, and this one really just shows also how we at Google, they tackle unconscious bias modeling in terms of the number of women that have corporate jobs, and how many women are actually employed in an organization, and the divide between the pay of women. And you'll actually see this in the video that I've given you the link to earlier. And by the way, wherever this came from, over to the side here, research reveals why men cheat, and it's not what you think. Business Insider, thank you for that piece of information. And so we show all of that to you to say that the ladder of inference is really at the base of even of our IC game and of implicit bias modeling, and the way bias and assumption modeling and unconscious bias training is an integral part of strategic foresight and futures thinking. So some of you will remember doing this, that we use the ladder of inference in a very practical and tactical way with our audience, by actually assigning the different parts of the ladder, each one a question. And what can we do with those questions? Well, we can actually take an article or a trend or a pattern or a cluster that we're thinking about. We can take a series or a group of scan hits during one of your weekly or monthly meetings, and you can actually have the group go through these set of questions and use them as a lens of unconscious bias modeling. They are the ladder of inference. They're each step on the ladder. Each question coincides and lines up with one part of the ladder. And by that, we're taking real world issues that we're dealing with, our focal issue, trends, patterns, emerging issues, and we're tackling them through the ladder. So a great place to actually do this is in a trend keynote. When you actually have recently been building your trend keynotes and you're wondering how to make them more engaging for your audience, then what you should do is use the ladder of inference questions at some point and say, let's stop for a moment and let's tackle this cluster that I just showed you some ideas about, trends around, and ways that's unfolding. And now I want you as the audience, as the participants, to actually give me your feedback on this issue or this cluster or this trend or this pattern using these questions. So, of course, the three most significant ideas, which lines up with the bottom of the ladder, remember, and you'll see the ladder in just a minute, where we look at the world around us like we're a video camera. What really stood out to you? What did you video record when you saw this issue? That both tells us what stood out to them and what they may have missed because of our biases. Number two, your opinion about the ideas, because remember, as we go up the ladder, we start to form opinions about the things that we video recorded and through our eyes and in our brain. Now that we've got that information, we make judgments about them. And the next thing we ask is, what are the impacts and implications of these ideas and these opinions that you formed about these ideas? What impacts and implications going forward 1, 3, 5, 10, 20 years out would that cause? And this is as we move up the ladder, as you'll see in just a minute. This lines up with really saying like, well, this is the outcomes. This is what would happen because of that. And then number 4, do you feel positive, negative, or neutral? Much like our IC game. All tied together now, right? And this is the next step in the ladder. The way we feel about it as we start to form ideas and central foundational beliefs about things, which you'll see in the next question. Are these ideas that you chose from this article or this cluster that we're talking about in line or at odds with your belief system? And then the last one of all, what actions, personal or societal or organizational or business actions might you take in terms of these emerging ideas or clusters or trends? And that lines up with the top of our ladder, where after we build beliefs, we take action. So this is a great way, and as you see the ladder of inference here, observable data, selected data, and then we make meaning, and out of that meaning we make assumptions, and out of those assumptions we draw conclusions, and out of those conclusions we form hard, strong beliefs that are just unconscious in the 99.9999%, and then we take action, and we hardly even know where that action is coming from. And by the way, if you're really, really thinking holistically here, this is where you start to see the ladder and you go, wait a second, this is very similar to CLA. Because at the top, above the water where the iceberg sticks out, you've got your actions, and everybody just thinks actions are actions, and then what they are what they are, and the world's gone crazy, and I don't know why people do these things. And when we start to think beneath the surface of the water, below actions, we start to see systems and structures and actors and worldviews and values and culture and myths and metaphors and cosmologies and foundational bedrock stories of the universe. And that's what you see down the ladder here: beliefs, conclusions, assumptions, meanings, observable data, the whole of the universe. But in the ladder, of course, we're building as we go up, and you see the ladders getting skinnier and skinnier. You remember all this. The reason we put the slide in is we wanted to really remind you of the two reflexive loops or recursive loops, where in the first one, which is the one that's closer to the middle, once we form beliefs, that impacts the data that we will select next time. So every time we form new, more narrow beliefs, then our data selection gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And futures thinking helps us broaden the ladder. Questions are beliefs. We don't have to let go of them, but we at least need to recognize them. And of course, as we mature, we do grow and change. And our beliefs, whether the foundational ones or not, change. Some of our belief systems do change, and they cause the ladder to breathe and grow so that we can select more data next time, and it's not just unconscious algorithms. The other reflexive loop, which is the bigger one, also shows that once we take actions, then the actions we take seclude us or lock us away or block us from or put a firewall up from the data we can even observe, much less select. We might now spend all of our time in only one part of the office building because of a certain action we took about putting up barriers, or HR only works on the 3rd floor now. We never interact with other parts of the company. There's much better examples than the ones I'm giving here. And so this is why, backing up one slide, you can use these questions, and if you just look between these 2 slides, you will see how the questions 1 through 6 line up with starting at the bottom of the ladder and going to the top. From observable data in question number 1, 3 most significant ideas, up to question number 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, your belief systems are the beliefs and the actions. And actually, as you'll see, I'm correcting myself before any of you can correct me. It's not the observable data. Question number 1 is selected data, of course, yes. And then 2 is, ties to meaning. Question number 3 to assumptions. Question 4 to conclusions. Question 5, as you'll see, to beliefs, and question 6 to your actions. And so you're actually using the ladder of inference as a practical, tactical tool instead of just as a mental model that you show to people who are coming on your team for the first time. You can use this every time you do a turn keynote, every time you take it on a roadshow in the company. And so I just wanted to end with these 2 slides. I believe there's only 2 left. And that's just to say that once you do this, you can also share with the audience how futures thinking, and they will see this as they go through the whole foresight process, really reveals our blind spots and unleashes and maximizes creativity. And you can read all that I've left you there. But also that futures thinking allows us to be more disruptive in our innovations. And for my LATAM brethren who are watching this, I hope that you're still... or that there in LATAM, that the innovation lab is beginning to really partner with the strategic foresight team, the global features team there, because features thinking, strategic foresight is a great way for us to really build innovation in our company. As a matter of fact, right now, just today, we received a request from a large Fortune 500 company who is already using foresight and has already gone to scenario building, and has been using scenarios for the past 6 years, but did it sort of haphazardly, or as I might say, willy-nilly. And Seema understood when I had a call with her the other day in India, the India team, this phrase willy-nilly, which means they just did it sort of haphazardly. They didn't really have a process. And because of that, they're scattered and they're all over the place. And they're really still not linking their features thinking to their innovation, which is what they want to do all along. They're asking Kaj now to help them to come back in, to straighten out their foresight efforts, and to really link them in a practical, tactical way, even with short-term wins, to their innovation development. So I hope my brethren, futures brethren in LATAM are helping the innovation lab there to link to the great and amazing ideas that they're building through futures thinking. And so that takes us to the end of our presentation today. It was a rather short one as compared to our other ones, but these are always meant to be stop and goes. You can watch and stop and come back at your leisure. And I will see you guys again in our next video module. Until then, take care and viva la future.